America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Main Street Matters. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Today, we are rejoined by Karen Harned. Karen is the Chief Legal Officer here at Job Creators Network Foundation. Karen, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we have so much to talk to you about because there's been so many things that have happened just in the latter part of this year, of course, in addition to a general election and a new administration coming in. But I thought we would bring you in and just talk about sort of the regulatory landscape that has changed dramatically from Chevron to, what the Regulatory Flexibility Act is and things like that. But before I get into like all of the sort of technical DC jargon, talk to us about how small businesses are impacted by regulations. A tax is easy to understand. My taxes are going up by 10%. My taxes are going down by 10%. But a regulation is hard to explain to people who don't deal with them. Help our audience understand what a regulation is and how it impacts small businesses.
Right. So regulations are, put forward by federal agencies, by unelected bureaucrats. And, they do have a role to play in that, Congress will pass a law and the actual details of how you comply with that law, they're not going to get into the complete nitty gritty. And that's really where the agencies are supposed to step in and give you the real to-dos, like here's your to-do list to be in compliance with this law. But what we've seen over the last several decades is the agencies have, not surprisingly, taken that power and tried to expand it. And so what they've been doing is making new laws, doing things that even Congress didn't ask them to do or didn't give them the authority to do. And from a small business perspective, the regulatory burden is a real one because if you're a 5 to 10 person business, you're having to spread those compliance costs, which are not helping you grow your business. There's no value add there. Most of the time it's the small business owner that's completing this, trying to understand what regulation even applies to their business, how they comply with it, and filling out the papers to do so. So paperwork in particular is a huge burden on small businesses. Whereas the big businesses, they have corporate departments that do this, and they even divide it up between labor and employment and, anything dealing with, Department of Transportation or goodness knows how many other agencies they might be dealing with. And so for the small business owners, again, it's really typically just the small business owner, or maybe they have a bookkeeper that does this and they're supposed to figure out how to comply and what to comply with. So I always say it's like the death of 10,000 regulations, right? Like for the small business owner, because you'll talk to a bureaucrat and they'll be like, oh, but this form is only going to take 15 minutes to fill out. Well, put it on the stack of these other forms that I have to fill out. Now I'm spending days, complying with regulations instead of working on my business. So that really is how it impacts the small business owner.
And to be not in compliance, sometimes those costs are even greater, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because the next thing you know, you get dinged, and dinged is tens of thousands of dollars. You could be the unlucky business owner that just has an OSHA inspector walk up to your business just because you're in the rotation. But, lots of times competitors or disgruntled employees will make a complaint. And the next thing you know, you've got some sort of government inspector in your business. And if they're going to go there, they're going to try to find something wrong. So you're typically going to get out of there with at least some sort of a fine or citation.
Yeah. And before I turn it over to Jordan, the Biden administration has been exceptionally active on the regulatory front for the last 4 years. Talk to us about how aggressive this administration has been. It's been everywhere from, energy to, just being the Corporate Transparency Act, which we'll talk about later. Talk to us about how big that burden has been and some of the biggest areas that have impacted our businesses and our economy overall.
Right. Well, the Biden administration has been very aggressive. They have done what is called a whole government approach on all sorts of things. Like for small business owners, I think the biggest one is really this whole environmental, green movement, trying to impose that on all manner of ways. So, we've really seen it with them trying to regulate everything from, the cars that we drive to the trucks that our businesses that, deliver products are going to be driving on the roads, wanting those to all be electric powered, in the blink of an eye, when a lot of times, especially for the trucks, those heavy duty trucks, that technology doesn't even exist right now. Similarly, they have been, pushing making all of our appliances more energy efficient, right? And all of that drives up the cost, not just for the purchaser of that. If you have a house and you need a new dishwasher, okay, that's going to be more expensive, but it's costing money for all the builders out there, right? Like the downstream effects of this are really great. It's making the cost of building a home higher. So everything they've really been doing in that space has really driven up the cost. And also it's under very questionable authority. Congress has not done anything with environmental laws since, I think, the Clean Air Act in 1991. So they're digging way back to find authority to do these things that I'm pretty sure Congress did not authorize them to do in the first place.
We had a big, us deregulation fans had a huge win this year, both with the election and also with the Supreme Court Loper-Brite decision, which struck down the Chevron precedent. Karen, can you just give our listeners a little background on that court decision and what that portends for the future of regulation?
Correct. So this was a case called Loper-Brite, and it concerned judicial philosophy or judicial deference that have been on the books since the 80s. And what it said was, whenever somebody is challenging a regulation and saying, this is going outside the agency's bounds, they're acting arbitrary, capricious, that the thumb is automatically on the scale with the judge for that agency. If there's any ambiguity in the statute, the tie goes to the agency. So that had a real practical effect because groups like ours and other litigants across the country that were really questioning, hey, I don't think EPA has the authority to, require us all to buy electric powered trucks, under the Clean Air Act. We had to go in and do the cost benefit analysis. Okay, bringing a lawsuit against the agency is going to be at least $1 million, probably more if we go all the way to the Supreme Court. And is it worth even doing that if we know that the deck stacked against us? Loper-Brite, even the playing field. Now we have the same chance at court as the agencies do. And so as a result, I think all of this nonsense we've seen over the past several decades of agencies really pushing their authority and pushing the envelope, we're going to be able to check that and pull that back through litigation because we know we have a fighting chance in the court because this deference has now gone away.
So, Karen, do you see legal action funds and on the conservative side making challenges? Is our side getting ready with challenges to test this new legal precedent? And if so, what regulations do you think are kind of ripe to go after?
So yeah, I think there are definitely several groups, including, quite frankly, Job Creators is looking for opportunities too, to see what regulations are out there that really were on shaky ground, and is it worth a challenge? And there's also an effort, research effort. What are the regulations tied? What statutory authorities are some of these regulations tied to? Sometimes they'll list a whole lot of regulations or a lot of statutes, and that may symbolize that there's really no authority there, right? They're throwing the kitchen sink in. So that's one approach. The other approach is going to be really holding agencies to task moving forward. Comments are going to be more important than ever because we're going to be able to make our legal arguments in those comments and really, raise our hand and say, hey, you guys, we're going to sue you if you go forward with this because we don't think you have the authority to do it, and make our legal case there and build the administrative record there. And again, know that record will get a really fair shot when we get before a court if ultimately we have to sue. So yeah, I think it's both looking back at regulations and also looking at regulations that are going to be in development. I'd also just say there was another case, Corner Post, that extended the statute of limitations for challenging regulations. Typically, once a regulation is issued, you have 6 years to challenge it. But now the Supreme Court has said that that 6 years starts when you, the business, are actually impacted by it negatively. So that really puts a whole new crop of regulations in play.
Karen, we had a big win, our organization, with a piece of legislation that we had supported and actually really been part of sort of the beginning of it. And that was the Prove It Act that recently passed the House. It's got a ways to go, obviously, but it's been well received by legislators. How does that play into everything that's happening in the regulatory landscape? Or, what will the Prove It Act do for small businesses? And why was it so important, as one of the pillars of our American Small Business Prosperity Plan? What does that do for our small businesses?
Well, that is going to be able to really make sure that agencies are doing what they're supposed to do when they look at small business impact. Because again, we have seen agencies over the last, at least 10 years, really shirking those responsibilities. They're supposed to really look at, is there an alternative way to regulate that's not going to be so burdensome on small business? But they don't have to do that analysis really if they say, hey, guess what? We don't think this regulation is going to impact that many small businesses. And so that's what they've been doing. They've been certifying that many of these regulations, including regulations like the independent contractor regulation, which I would challenge anybody on this call that's a small business owner to tell me that they don't use independent contractors. I mean, most small businesses do. So the idea that did not impact a significant number of small businesses is absurd on its face.
And what's the independent contractor rule? Just real quick, so people understand.
I'm sorry, and that is the rule that allows. Actually, the rule is making it harder for you to use independent contractors. It's going to make it so that most workers are going to be classified as employees, not independent contractors, which means you're talking payroll taxes and any benefits and other things like that. You would have to pay an employee. You would have to pay those
which
workers.
Affects the gig economy tremendously.
100%. Yes,
Uber, all of that.
Right, they're in the bullseye of that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that's a good example of one where they certified it didn't impact small business. And the problem right now is, under the law, if we want to challenge that certification, we have to wait till the rule goes into effect. Well, at that point, the game's over. Everybody's already having to comply. I actually, in a previous life, had a case where the judge ruled in our favor. You know what? EPA should have certified, but they didn't. So guys, next time you need to certify. Well, okay. All of our businesses were already complying with the rule for 5 years at that point. So this will let us go in and sue if they don't certify. And if we challenge the certification and they don't do their homework on our challenge, like they don't address our concerns, even at that stage before we even get to the litigation, then the rule doesn't apply to small businesses. They're exempt until they do what they're supposed to do under the law. So it really will be a game changer because it's going to make every agency really have to do their homework meaningfully, not just check the box when it comes to will their regulation impact small business and, doing the homework to minimize that impact.
I think the overtime rule is a great example of that. When President Trump was elected the first term, he came in and I don't know, he wiped it out or by executive order got rid of it. I forget what he actually did, but it was like the 11th hour, about to go into effect. But the problem is that everybody had already complied, a year ahead of time and made all these changes and impacted employees who were salary, and they moved them to hourly. And so people sort of lost that, freedom of being on salary and what it means to move into management and things like that. So you're right. I think the Prove It Act is just, it's a game changer in that, the agencies are going to say, well, all of these businesses can say this impact us. So it's null and void. So they're only going to impact the big businesses anyway that can afford to deal with the regulations. And I just love, and the bottom line is, it forces them to do their jobs. Imagine that.
Absolutely. No. And that's the thing. They only want to do their job when it's like giving them more power and making people do more things. They don't want to do the work they're supposed to do on the front end. Because as we all know, it's really hard to undo a regulation, which is what we always argue when they start complaining about, oh, the small business impact analysis is so hard and burdensome and makes everything go so slow. Well, I mean, once that reg's on the books, getting it off is next to impossible. So they really should be doing the work on the front end.
Yeah, agree. Well, great work on that, Karen. I mean, just really appreciate all the work you did in getting that through. And, hopefully the new Congress will take it up. I think that President Trump would certainly be interested in signing a piece of legislation like that. I mean, he's certainly shown he's very pro small business.
Absolutely.
Do you think we can get 7 Democrats to sign on to get it passed?
I mean, you never know. I think there's a shot. We're going to keep pushing. I mean, honestly, did I think we were even going to get it through that, House? I know that sounds crazy since it is controlled by the Republicans, but honestly, this was the first meaningful regulatory reform we've even gotten through through the House Judiciary Committee. And I think it might be 20 years. So we have made great strides, and we've gotten it all the way through one chamber. So, and it's, I think the messaging on this is right. And we do have a champion. You are right, Elaine, with the president, because he understands world as a regulated entity. And he speaks like somebody that has had to deal with a lot of regulatory bureaucracy. So that works in our favor. And he can be a good salesman for us on this.
Mm-hmm.
Karen, speaking of the administration, where do you think they're going to look in their first couple of months to roll back some of these Biden regulations?
Well, I think, independent contractor I mentioned earlier, I would like to think that's like an easy target for them, because they had a very good rule that really was in line with the 21st century and the gig economy, and gave a lot of flexibility to workers and businesses. And that rule got overridden by the Biden administration, but is currently tied up in the courts. And so I think reestablishing his rule would be one thing he could do right then. I think he's going to also put a pause on all of these regulations that haven't taken effect. He had great luck his first term in office through the Congressional Review Act, going through regulation or through laws that got passed or regulations, that got enacted later in Obama's term. We've got that same situation going on now with some rules. So, hopefully we can get rid of those. And if Congress passes a Congressional Review Act on those, the agency can't even touch that subject again. That forbids them from even regulating in that way again, which is really great. He'll also probably do some executive orders and things to reestablish the good government practices that he had going in his first administration on regulatory transparency, making sure guidance documents are on the websites, having regulatory compliance officers that help at each agency. He did a lot in this space his first term.
We've heard a lot of reporting that the Biden administration is working on Trump-proofing their environmental regulations and Trump-proofing the government against Trump doing anything, essentially. How could they even do that with a new administration coming in? I mean, they're going to attempt to keep to allow 47,000 people to work from home and keep empty buildings. I mean, they're doing it all in plain sight. Obviously, they're showing us how much money they want to waste of taxpayer dollars. But how do they Trump-proof these regulations to keep them in place when they are coming from regulatory agencies and they're not legislative?
I don't think they're going to be able to do that. I mean, they are going to be able to spend our money, sadly. I don't know. The only people that can stop them from that is Congress, and maybe in some of this last minute, you might see them try to curb that. But honestly, they've got so many other issues. I'm not optimistic there. But yeah, I think on the regulatory side, they could spend money. They could do grants. They can do that kind of thing. But everything else, is going to be subject to challenge, and even immediately. So I'm more encouraged on that front, that we just have to kind of hold on tight for these next month or whatever. But it is going to be really maddening to watch our money just go flying out the door. And I really don't know what we can do to stop it.
Mm-mm. No, not at all. What about the bill that we've been talking a lot about is the Corporate Transparency Act? Tell our audience about that. How significant is that for small businesses, and what are the consequences? I think a lot of people will be surprised to hear about these consequences. So
this is a law that Congress passed, and a Department of the Treasury is enforcing, and it was set to go in effect January 1, but it's been ruled unconstitutional by a district court. So it's currently in litigation. And as of this recording, we do not, as small business owners, have to comply if you're an existing business that was in business prior to January 1 of 2024. You don't need to worry about reporting. But what do you have to report? You have to report who your owners of your business are. You have to report, you can't just use their taxpayer ID numbers. You have to use their social security numbers. So you are giving the government, who we know is not the best with our data, our personal data once again, if and when we are required to do this reporting. And it really is setting up a big game for small businesses of gotcha, because it only applies to businesses with 20 or fewer employees. The big businesses don't have to worry about this. And it's not just a fine, which fines in and of themselves are bad, because it's, I think, up to $10,000 per violation, maybe. I don't know. It's thousands of dollars. But it's also criminal penalties. There's also jail time that can be associated with noncompliance. And if you look at the Department of Treasury's own numbers, and Job Creators Network's data tracks this, most small businesses don't even know they have to do this. So they're going to be out of compliance to begin with, because they don't even know this exists. That was a huge battle when this law was being debated, was how are you even going to tell small business owners that they need to do this? How are they even going to find out? Some accountants are telling, but not all. And so that is why you're seeing such low compliance rates as it is. So we are very encouraged that this will ultimately get, stopped in the courts. And we are also on a parallel track trying to get it overturned in Congress. And we think that Trump, again, hopefully will be on our side on this one. But we do really need to stop it, because it really is just setting small businesses up for being found in violation of the law. And it's not just civil penalties. Again, it's jail time potentially.
So the difference here is that this was not a regulation, though. This was legislation passed through Congress, signed into law by the president. Why target small businesses in this way? I mean, why are they the boogeyman in this case?
Right. So their whole argument was this was a way to catch all of the terrorists funding, shade businesses in America and getting money launderers and all of these things, which that is a good and laudable goal. But I don't know any terrorist that's going to go fill out this form correctly and not lie. Similar with the money launderers, they're already engaged in fraudulent behavior. So the only people you're really hurting are the people that are law abiding, by giving them another form and now attaching jail time to them not filling it out.
Good point.
Karen, aside from Job Creators Network's website, where do you recommend our listeners go to find out more about what's happening with regulations and the fight against them?
Yeah. So that's a good question. There's a lot of different things. I would say, the Competitive Enterprise Institute does a nice job on letting you know where the current tally is on regulations. Wayne Cruz does a great article for Forbes on that on a at least monthly basis from there. Also, American Action Forum does a regulatory roundup, I think every week. That's another great resource. And the George Washington Regulatory Studies Center will tell you what's coming out of the agencies that might be of interest, and does a good job curating news articles on it. So there's a number of places out there for the regulatory geeks like me that like to follow this stuff.
Well, we're glad we have you to explain all of this sort of red tape and a nightmare that can be for small businesses. So thank you so much for coming on and joining us today on Main Street Matters, America's Small Business Megaphone. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.